So nice to see all of you, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce you to Professor Moshe Vardi, who is the Noah Harding Professor of Computer Science and a department chair at Rice University. Prior to his joining Rice University in December of 1993, he was at the IBM Almaden Research Center, where he managed the mathematics and related computer science department. Vardi received his PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1981, and after 5 years of service as an officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, he, actually that's the end of the sentence. I'm so sorry. He is also the author and co-author of over 100 technical papers, as well as a book titled Reasoning About Knowledge. Vardi is the recipient of 3 IBM Outstanding Innovation Awards and an editor of several international journals. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Vardi.
I have to deal with... Okay, can you hear me? As you can gather from my bio, I do have a foreign accent. I'm told that by some people that they find it hard to understand. Rest assured, it will not improve during the next hour and a half. If you have a hard time understanding me, there is a door in the back. The official title of this talk is The Development of the Silicon Chip. But upon reflection, preparing it over the last week, I decided to have a little catchier title, which I think captured the spirit of what I want to talk to them about, to you tonight. Who started the information revolution? Normally, when we hear the word revolution, this is the picture that we kind of have in mind. This is what revolutions look like. This is, in case you wonder, a beautiful rendering of the Visigoth sacking Rome. But it does seem to capture what a revolution is, or so we think. And one reason we come up with such picture is because typically we think of political revolutions. The American revolutions, French revolutions, Russian revolutions, all pretty bloody revolutions. But political revolutions in a big scheme of things are small potato. Economic revolutions are much more significant. If you think we had 2 major ones in our history, the agricultural revolution, when we went from hunter-gatherers to being farmers, and the industrial revolution that's still continuing to this very day. Even bigger revolutions are cultural revolutions. The invention of writing, I know, maybe 6,000 years ago. An invention of printing that many people claim is the biggest invention of this millennium. Well, many people are saying that we are now at the beginning stage of a revolution that is both economic and cultural at the same time. The computer revolution, the information revolution. Here is a quote that seems to capture the spirit of this view. Civilization now stands at one of those great historic junctures that arise only a few times in a millennium. The central organizing forces of society are being reshaped by powerful new technology of light and silicon. The next few decades will witness profound alterations, not only in the way we live, work, entertain, and inform ourselves, but also in the strategies of business, the dynamic of the marketplace, the competition between companies and between countries, the process of wealth creation, and even the role of government. The digital revolution is going to transform the personal future of everyone.
Is it turned on?
Turn itself off. Okay? Sorry about that. This is from a book a few years ago by Burson and Klein called Road Warriors. Or here is another quote. A new technology is opening up new vistas for democracies, education, and personal enrichment. The government will be a living thing to its citizens instead of an abstract and unseen force. Elected representatives will not be able to evade their responsibility to those who put them in office. The new medium will be like a gigantic school and have a greater student body than all our universities put together. Now, this one was published in Radio Broadcast Magazine, 1922. So obviously, heady words about technology and its impact have been with us for quite a while. And therefore, skeptics abound. A column in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago called Futurist Schlock. The internet promises to change society as we know it, letting people work wherever they want, reinventing government, and creating new communities. Of course, people said the same thing about the telephone 100 years ago. Futurists predicted that the telephone would, among other things, bring peace on earth and eliminate southern accents. Well, we know it is not eliminated Israeli accents for sure. Michael Bloomberg, who may actually is a technology company. Technology has a way of contradicting its prophets. Remember those predictions of 30 years ago that all automobiles would run on electricity, that wrecks or highway confusion would be a thing of the past? Guess what? Wrecks still happen, people still get lost on the highways, and autos are still powered by fossil fuel. Thank God for that, we're in Texas. So maybe it is all hype. But on the other hand, there is yet another danger of underestimating technology. Thomas Watson Sr., founder of IBM, said in 1943, I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers. Patent attorneys at Bell Labs in the 50s initially balked at even filing a patent for the laser. They couldn't see what is the relevant to telephony. As you may know today, the internet, our phone calls all go through cables, which are the lights. The communication is through laser light. In fact, very often, even scientists cannot appreciate the impact of their own inventions. Here's a beautiful anecdote from a book by Riordan and Hodgson called Crystal Fire, about the invention of the transistor. At an annual dinner in the early 1900s, physicists working at the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, who were involved in the very conception of the field of electronics, commonly gave one another the following toast: to the electron, may it never be of any use to anybody. So here we stand. On one hand, some people are proclaiming that, the second coming practically. And on the other hand, we have people who are saying, oh, this is just big hype. We had telephone, we have radio, television, one more thing. So how we decide? How should we decide? So to enable us to think about what's happening, I have to tell you a little old story. And it's about a wonderful game called chess that was proverbially invented in China maybe 1,000 years ago. And the emperor just loved the game. He thought this was a wonderful game. He couldn't stop playing the game, and he really wanted to reward the inventor. So he called the inventor and says, you've invented, this is a wonderful invention, this game. How can I reward you? What would you like for this game? The inventor said, I am a very humble inventor. I need very little. All I want from you is a little rice. I want 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard. And then 2 grains of rice for the second square, and 4 for the third, 8 for the fourth, etc. Emperor says, are you sure? You're talking to the emperor. You can ask for a whole lot more. The inventor said, no, this is good enough for me. All I need is make sure that I get enough rice. OK. The emperor happily granted this apparently modest request. And everything went fine for about the first 32 squares. After 32 squares, he could produce the several billion grains of rice fairly well on a 1/4 square mile of rice fields. But after the first 32 squares, things began to get really interesting. Can you imagine if you get a quarter of a square mile, then the next time it's half a square mile, and then it's a mile. Well, you go on, you discover there isn't enough arable land on Earth to produce enough rice. There are two versions of how this story has ended. One version claimed that this was the end of the Ming Dynasty. The other version says that somewhere on a lonely road in China, there's a little stick and a skull on the top of the stick. So why I'm telling you this story? Because it's important to understand what's happening when you have exponential progression. What was the key here? That you have to double the amount of rice every day. There's another way of looking at it, and this is called the lily leaf parable. Biologists tell a story of the lily leaf, which doubles its size every day. The day before it completely covers the pond, the water is only half covered. And the day before that, only a quarter covered, and the day before that, only a measly eighth. So while the lily grows imperceptibly all summer long, only in the last week of the cycle would bystander notice its sudden appearance. If I ask most of you, when did you hear about the internet, for example, you would say, well, maybe 1995, maybe 1996, maybe some people who are very technology-oriented, maybe 1994. But the internet has been with us since 1969. So you have to think about the lily leaf parable to understand why does it seem suddenly to explode into existence. Well, what's driving the information revolution is the same phenomenon of exponential progress. Every year or two, the amount of processing speed you can buy for $1 doubles. In fact, if you need a computer, don't buy. Wait. Keep waiting. Keep waiting. The deal just gets better and better. Every year or two, the amount of memory you can buy for $1 doubles. That's been going on since the early 60s. It still is going to go. There is a debate, but it probably at least go for 1 decade more. Here is a nice way to view it. This is a chart that shows the cost of memory. It's a bit hard to read here. It says the price per megabyte in US dollars. Okay? So you can see where it was in 1988, and it's just dropping to today the cost of megabytes is probably a few cents, less than that. Now, just to imagine what such progress means, let's compare it to transportation technology. Let's go back to the Pioneer covered wagon, about 20 miles a day. That was a good pace. Early automobile, let's say Model T, 20 miles per hour. Supersonic aircraft, 20 miles per minute. This is about a factor of 1,000, but it took about 150 years to accomplish it. Now imagine what happens when you squeeze it into a period of 10 or 15 years. And in fact, it's entertaining to think what would have happened if over the last 30 years, transportation technology would have improved at the same pace as information technology. We would have cars the size of a toaster. It's another question how we fit in. It will cost about $200, go about 100,000 miles per hour using less of 1 gallon of fuel. There's another question, what happens when it crashes, when you have to reboot it while you're on the road? In fact, if you have a laptop today, it's much more powerful than the mainframe in the university when you or I went to college about 20 years ago. In fact, if you bought a Hallmark singing card, that little chip there that does the singing has more computing power than the first computer, the ENIAC, that weighed 30 tons. So why is it happening? What's happening here? Gordon Moore, a co-founder of Intel, who will come back in our story later, predicted in 1965 the transistor density The amount of transistors you can pack on one chip, and a chip is something about big, about the size of a fingernail or a little bigger, will double about every 18 months. Will double. Okay. Now remember the story of the chess inventor. What happened when things keep doubling? And this has been going on now. Every year and a half it doubles, and it's been going on since the early 60s. So now you can understand why things seem to be moving at the pace that they're moving, why things are moving so fast. One of the things that's happening as a result is there are computers everywhere. Computers are ubiquitous. If you go back 30 years ago, then there were maybe 50,000 computers in the whole world. But 20 years later, every day, 50,000 computers were sold. In 1995, which is the last point which I had the statistics, they were sold, 50,000 were sold every 10 hours. And I would guesstimate now that it probably has doubled since then. So we are selling probably about 10,000 computers per hour over the whole world. But the issue is not just that computers are everywhere. The fact that they're so powerful enables us to do things that you just couldn't imagine before. Things that you could think were science fiction are just about to happen. So here's one example. A needleless dock. So the idea is that we are going to be able to do blood tests without ever taking out blood. All you have to do is get under your tongue and with a little camera and take a video of your capillaries. And then the computer will process it and immediately give you results without ever drawing a drop of blood. This sounds just out of Star Trek. But the company is going to start marketing this product this year. Or another application, somewhat more entertaining. It's called Be Careful Before You Flush. The health management toilet, a smart John built by the Japanese company Toto, contains diagnostic system that uses biosensor input to examine your output. Networking technology then send the data to your doctor. Those in need of monitoring, people with liver, kidney, or other health problems, will have to shell out only about $3,000 for the peace of mind afforded by the remote diagnostic potty. It's already here. It's not science fiction. What's underlying this amazing progress? This is the key word I want you to remember from this evening. It is something called the microprocessor. What is a microprocessor? Well, again, it's a little thing. It's about big. It's essentially one piece of silicon on which a whole circuitry, and we're going to see, amazing complexity of circuitry is built. So by now we have on a chip about the state-of-the-art chips will have 20 million transistors connected by incredibly fine wires. Just to give you an idea that today the width of a wire is about 180 atoms. I mean, 180 atoms it's about probably you have to lay 500 such lines to get one hair. Okay, this is how small it is. The key thing is that this is not a tool that does one thing. The microprocessor is a computer. You write different program, it does different things. Right? This is different. You have a toaster, it toasts. Dishwasher washes. Microprocessor can do many different things. You have to write the right program for it. That's the key thing. Now, this is one of the major inventions of the century. But anybody here knows who invented the microprocessor? We have such an incredible invention, but by and large, people don't know who are the inventors. So what I'm going to do in the next part of this talk is to try to talk about this story and tell you the story. Some of it you may have seen tidbits here and there, but I want to tell you the full story, how the microprocessor and the personal computer came about. We might think that what happened was we started with big computers, and over time, we got better and better in making computers, so they got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they got to be this big. But that's not the way it happened. Big computers and little computers are completely different beasts, created by completely different people. It is logical to assume that personal computers came from shrinking a mainframe. But that is not the way it happened. The PC business actually grew up from the semiconductor industry. Instead of being a little mainframe, the PC is, in fact, more like an incredibly big chip. Remember, they don't call it Computer Valley. They call it Silicon Valley. And in fact, if you remember, there used to be a mini computer company called Digital Equipment Corporation. The CEO of that company did not believe that you need to have a computer on your desk. And that company does not exist today. It's been bought by Compaq a year or two ago. So let's see how this story evolved. And to see it, you have to go back, first of all, to 1946. 1946, the first computer, the ENIAC, was built. This was an incredible invention. It was also incredibly large by today's standards. The ENIAC had 18,000 vacuum tubes. It sucked 150 watts and weighed 30 tons. The warmth and the light of the tubes attracted bugs. And this is where the phrase computer bug comes from. They were real, honest to God bugs. Now, this was really unwieldy. And one of the big problems is that you know what happens when you have a bulb, a light bulb. It burns after a while. So just replacing the vacuum tube was a full-time business. And in fact, there was a science fiction author, Arthur Clarke, that predicted in the 40s that there will be communication satellites. But he thought that they will have to be manned. And the reason is somebody will have to replace the vacuum tubes. In December 23, 1947, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley demonstrated the transistor to Bell Lab executives. The transistor was a little semiconductor device that was able to replace the vacuum tube. This was, some people said this is the invention of the century. But it was reported on page 46 of the New York Times. But this point is so important in this history that Bill Gates allegedly says, my first stop on any time travel expedition would be Bell Labs in December 1947. So this is December 1947. The transistor is invented. William Shockley was the manager of the group. But in a few years, he's having a midlife crisis. He buys a Jaguar. His marriage is falling apart. He'd like to move up in management, but he's not a very good manager. In fact, at that point, Bardeen and Brattain already tried to get out of one of them left the group, another, in fact, left Bell Labs, allegedly because of him. So he's clearly stuck where he is, and he wants to move further. He goes to he goes to a visit in Washington, D.C., and he meets a woman called Amy Lansing, and he likes her, so he takes a job at Washington, D.C., except that during the same year, she gets a job offer from Ohio, and she goes to Ohio. So nothing more to do in Washington, D.C., decides it's time to make some money, and he wants to go to, he has some friends in California. He goes to Palo Alto, and he wants to start a new company called Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory. Now, at this time, there was no venture capital. You had to find somebody to find you. Beckman Instruments was a company in LA, agreed to provide the funding, and this company was started. They did get married after all, the same year. She moved to California also. And she stayed with him until he died. Now, Shockley believed in talent. He wants to hire the people that he calls with the highest mental temperatures. So what does he do? He goes to Bell Labs. You know lots of people in Bell Labs, and he tries to steal people from Bell Labs. But that doesn't work because then people in Bell Labs also know him. So that doesn't work. So but he's incredibly famous at this point. This is the person who invented the transistor. He's a very famous physicist. He goes after talent. He's very good at identifying talent. In particular, he hired two very brilliant people, Bob Noyce, about 29 years old physicist, and Gordon Moore, who's a really young people, 27-year-old chemist. It's funny that he really didn't trust people. So he didn't just hire them based on interview. He wanted them to take psychological tests. And one of the anecdotes people tell is their test boss says, very talented, not management material. Remember that. In November of 1956, he's notified that he won the Nobel Prize. Well, obviously, he's elated. This is actually November, the time of the year. I just heard the news about Nobel Prize in economics. He is very excited. And I think there is a picture here. We see Shockley and the other folks toasting when he got notified about the Nobel Prize. Here are also pictures. You can see here pictures of this is Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce a few years later. They were a bit younger at the time. So for him, when he got the Nobel Prize, this was probably one of the happiest moments in his life. But things are not going very well at Shockley's semiconductor laboratory. Remember, he was a terrible manager in Bell Labs. He didn't get any better by moving to the West Coast. Here is a beautiful sentence from one of the books about this. It says, Shockley's managerial incompetence paled in comparison to his abiding paranoia and volcanic temper. This is not a nice guy. And very early on, already in 1957, people are telling him, this is not working. We can't work like that. But he is not amenable to anything. In March 1957, a secretary cuts her hand on a little piece of metal. Shockley says, this is sabotage. I want every employee here to take polygraph test. I want to find the saboteur. I mean, the scientist had to take the little piece of metal, put it under a microscope, and prove to him that simply was a pin that the head broke off. People really couldn't take it. Moore calls Beckman. Remember, Beckman is the founder. And Beckman says, things are not going well, are they? Moore replied, no, not really. But Shockley is a Nobel Prize winner. And Beckman is having a very hard time firing a Nobel Prize winner. So the grumbling goes on, but Beckman tells the dissident, Shockley is the boss. You guys find a way to work with him. Well, they couldn't. On September 18, 1957, the traitorous 8, that's how Shockley called them. That's not the day they described themselves. The traitorous 8, which included Moore and Noyce, resigned from Shockley Semiconductors. He was on vacation in Cape Cod. He felt incredibly betrayed. He never spoke to them again. So what do? This traitorous 8? They decided that they liked the idea of Shockley. Shockley wanted to take semiconductors and turn them from science into industry, into technology. They wanted to do the same thing. So they had to get funding. And they managed to get $1.3 million funding from a company, East Coast company, called Fairchild Camera and Instruments. And they started a new venture called Fairchild Semiconductors, it was located in Mountain View, just next to Palo Alto, California. This is the first venture capital deal in Silicon Valley. It's a very important deal. In fact, Fairchild, I don't know how many of you have heard of this company, has incredible history, incredibly important. Here is a quote. Fairchild Semiconductor was the vocational school for Silicon Valley. Here, the engineers could screw up without serious repercussions. After all, nobody knew how the job can be done either. And they could learn from their mistakes. At Fairchild Semiconductor, the freewheeling, throttle to the firewall business of Silicon Valley was forged. Or David A. Kaplan, another author. Fairchild Semiconductor was the first of the nerd-driven companies that embodied the Silicon Valley culture. At a conference in Sunnyvale, California in 1969, so it's about 10 years later, it was said that of 400 engineers present, fewer than 2 dozens never worked for Fairchild. So Fairchild played a very important role in the history of Silicon Valley. But Fairchild is not the only company in the semiconductor business. There is a Texas company called Texas Instruments. Both companies are dealing with the same problem. At this point, they know how to make transistors. And transistors are a little sliver of silicon. But then you have to build circuits. And that was done manually. It was incredibly difficult work. You have to connect them. You have to solder them. The soldering had to work. What I'm reading, men could never do this work. Only women had the patience and the dexterity to do this kind of work. And as you want to build more and more complicated things, it became more and more difficult. The industry was in despair. They talk about the tyranny of numbers. The bigger the numbers, more difficult the job is. On July 24, 1958, Jack Kilby of TI had a flash of insight. He said, the problem is that we are trying to connect these things by real wires. And then, indeed, within a few months, on September 12, he was able to turn on the first integrated circuits. In this case, he bought an oscillator. It looked crude, he said, and it was crude, but it worked. And on February 6, 1959, TI filed for a broad-based patent application for miniaturized electronic circuits. This is happening in Texas. What's happening in California? Well, they have the same problem. It's very difficult to connect these transistors. So they're working on the same problem. And independently, they arrive at the same solution, integrated circuits. So Bob Noyce wrote, in many applications, it would be desirable to make multiple devices on a single piece of silicon. And they also filed for a patent. This was a narrow patent. The patent has a claims. Their patent was much narrower. It was called Semiconductor Device and Lead Structure. But they filed it on July 59. Let's just go back to look at the date. TI filed it in February 59. Fairchild only filed it in July. But they had a narrow patent. A narrow patent is easier to examine. So their application was approved fairly quickly. On April 25, 1961, the US Patent Office gave Fairchild, or Noyce, the patent. And TI had to wait for 3 more years. They fought like hell over this for years. But they couldn't win. It ended up with a cross-licensing agreement. But notice this tie between Intel and TI. It will come back. Let's see how well we can see. This is OK, here it is. This is one of the very first integrated circuits. So you see that it's a piece of silicon, and you see there are different components. In this case, very small number of components. But it's all done on one piece of silicon. That's the key, one piece of silicon.
What is silicon?
Silicon is a material. Sand is made from silicon and oxygen. So silicon is a very abundant material. Okay? It's an inert material. That's why they make silicon implants to put in the body. It's very cheap. Silicon is incredibly cheap. You just have to take sand, and you can produce silicon. So Fairchild is doing very well. In fact, it does so well that the investors, which is the East Coast company, Fairchild Camera and Instruments, decides to cash in. And part of the funding agreement was they have the option of buyback. So they buy Fairchild semiconductors. The Traitorous 8 get rich. But now this West Coast company is being managed directly by an East Coast company. That's not working very well. The manager of the East Coast company were called by the West Coast people seagull managers. Why? They fly in, they moot some free food, they shit on everyone, and then they go away. This was the death knell of Fairchild. Took many more years for the final death to occur. But really, that turning point, when Fairchild went from an independent West Coast company to a subsidiary of East Coast company, was the end of Fairchild. By 1969, 61, people started quitting Fairchild. Now remember that Noyce and Moore themselves were quit another company to start a company. So that idea was emulated again and again and again. The people who left Fairchild were called the Fairchildren. And by some accounting, at least 100 Silicon Valley companies can trace their genealogy back to Fairchild. Even Noyce and Moore, who founded the company, but now they're not their own bosses, they have bosses. In a few years, they themselves finally get tired of being managed by the Seagull managers. And in 1968, they leave and they start Intel. Intel stands for Integrated Electronics. Afterly, once they chose the name, they found out it was owned by a local motel. And they had to buy the name from the motel. Fairchild itself stayed there, just gradually declining. Only in the, when was that happening? I think in about the mid-80s, finally, it sold to another Texas company, Schlumberger, and disappeared. Today, we don't hear about Fairchild anymore. Just as a point, in the 1990s, Fairchild once legendary headquarters in Mountain View were bulldozed in favor of another startup, Netscape Communication. So nothing new under the sun. We just recycle things. So by now, Fairchild is making semiconductors, and it's a very good business. But what are people making with semiconductors? Not microprocessor yet. There's no microprocessor at this point. Well, some of the things that they make, you might remember, one of the first big impact was handheld calculators. Finally, from being a big business machine, you can buy a calculator, hold it in your hand, do it. Started from about $100, but then the price very quickly went down to just a few bucks. Digital watches started. And again, it was very good business for a while for the US. Today, I don't think anybody in the US makes these kind of things. It all went to the East. But it started US and started $250 again, went down to a few bucks. Bigger impact has the invention of video games. In 1972, Nolan Bushnell and Al Alcorn started a company called Atari. The first name was Siggy, but people didn't like it. They make a game called Computer Space. It's a disaster. Why is it a disaster? Because it's too complicated. So they come up with another game called Pong. They would describe as so mindless and self-evident, a monkey could instantly understand it. It was a runaway success. People stood in line in bars to play Pong. People, not monkeys, people. Bushnell had a hit, and once in a lifetime consumer creation, a new genre was created. In fact, today, the video game business is a huge business. I think it's bigger than the movie business. It's a huge business. And in fact, it's driving computer technology to a large extent, even today. Let's return to Intel. Remember, Moore and Noyce went to Intel in 1968. By now, they are experienced managers. They are fairly well known. So they have no problem raising about $2.5 million in just a couple of days on the phone. And they start making, they go into a new market. They start a new market, semiconductor memories. They start making chips, 256 bits. Okay? This is small memory. If you remember what you have today, you probably have on your computer 32 megabit, 64 megabit. This is 256 bits. The company is very successful. It went public in 1979. Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce got rich again. Playboy went public the same day. But within a year, Financial World declared, Wall Street has spoken. It's memories over mummeries. Bob Noyce died from cancer in 1990, fairly young. Gordon Moore is still alive, and he's worth about $10 billion, just a sec. He's worth about $10 billion, and he's reputedly the richest man in California. Not on the West Coast, California. Question there.
Doctor, that said 256 bit. Was it bit or bytes?
To the best of my knowledge, it was bit.
So you divide that by 8?
Yeah, in terms of how many bytes you divide it by 8, right? Now, this is a company that makes one product, memory chips. Now, here is the plot thickens. 1969, a Japanese calculator company called Busicom, they want to build a chip, to build a calculator. So they go to Intel and says, we would like you to design for us a chipset, a chipset of 12 chips that will together constitute a calculator. And they gave him also very aggressive price targets. So the people at Intel looks at it, and the guy was called Martian E. Edward Hoff, or known as Ted Hoff, looks at it and said, it's going to be very difficult to design it and meet your pricing target. But I have an idea. Why don't instead we make one chip that can run programs? So you will build it with this one chip, and then you can write the program that will provide the function of the calculator. Okay, this was the idea, and he came up with the idea of what's called a microprocessor, one chip on which you can run different programs. Hoff, together with Ten Mazor and a Japanese engineer called Masatoshi Shima, designed the system. So they came up how to build a microprocessor, but it was a charts on paper. It wasn't the real design of how to actually build it, just how it could be built. This started in 1969. 6 months later, in April 1970, Shima comes to visit Intel, and he sees there's nothing. Same chart that they drew 6 months ago. He gets very angry. I came here to check, he says. There's nothing to check. This is just an idea. So Intel gets pretty frantic, and they hire a new employee who came from Fairchild, of course. His name is Federico Fagin, and he's a very good designer. In about a few months, he designed a product called the 4004. And this is a 4-bit microprocessor. So this was the design, and then they went on to make. Here is a picture of the first microprocessor, the 4004. Okay, so this is a very important historical moment. The first microprocessor was designed and built. In fact, I can show you a picture, not just how it looked from outside, but how it looks from inside. Okay, this is a picture of the first microprocessor. It has 2,300 transistors. If you are patient, you can almost count them one by one. Remember, today we're talking about chips with 20 million transistors. Okay, it's about 1,000 times more complicated than this one. This is the 4004, and we'll come back to our story again later. This is Ted Hoff. Person made this incredible invention, not very well known. And we also have here a picture of the Italian guy, Italian physicist called Federico Fagin. So this is but the deal was they made this design for a Japanese company. Who is the owner of the design? The Japanese company. They paid for it. In March 1971, Intel ships the 404 to Busicom. Busicom says, too expensive. It's very competitive. The calculator business gotten very, very competitive. We need a cheaper. This is too expensive. The designer, Hoff, Mazor, and Fagin, says, well, we think that this is a good product. They go to the Intel management and they says, why don't we offer to buy back from them the rights? Right now, Busicom has exclusive right to the 4004. Why don't we give them some money so they'll get better price and we get back the rights? This sounds like a good deal, but Intel marketing objected. They didn't see the point. What we do with microprocessors? Who would want to buy microprocessors? And they made the following calculation. They said, look, computer companies sell 20,000 computers a year. We are latecomers. How much of this market can we capture? Maybe 10%. We'll be selling 2,000 microprocessors per year. Just not worth it. It wasn't worth for them $60,000. Moore and Noyce, nevertheless, decided to approve the deal. But not because they thought this is a good product. They said, This will help us sell memory. Our real product are semiconductor memories. This will help us sell memories. So Busicom sold the right backs to Intel for $60,000 to the 4004. Shortly after that, they went bankrupt. Okay, so they sold back an incredible product to Intel for pittance, $60,000. Now, at this point, Intel doesn't know exactly what to do with the product, but nevertheless, they decide to advertise. And in November 1971, advertised in Electronic News, announcing a new era of integrated electronics, a micro-programmable computer on a chip. But really, people don't know exactly what to do with this thing at this point. So what happens next? Just remember the dates. November 71. But in June 71, TI has already announced a CPU. CPU is Central Processing Unit. CPU is a technical term for a computer, microprocessor. TI is announcing a CPU on a chip. TI was just going together with Intel, coming up with essentially the same invention, independently, about the same time. Intel was stunned. They thought they really had something nobody else has. So they said, so far we only have a 4-bit. Bit is the smallest unit of information, 0 or 1, that's a bit. So we have a 4-bit, we have to make something better. They go and Fagin rush to complete the next design, the 8008, which is going to be an 8-bit microprocessor. In 1972, two teenagers in Seattle used this microprocessor, the 8008, and they built a machine to measure traffic flow on city streets. These teenagers are called William Henry Gates and Paul Allen. And they started a company called Trafo Data. You didn't hear about it. Didn't do very well. In March 1974, Intel announced the 8080. Some people call it the single most important product of the 20th century. It was 10 times faster than the original 4004, same price. Remember what's happening here, right? Things get better all the time, but price actually sometimes decline. So it doesn't cost more, it costs $360. This was a runaway success. In the time between 1971, where people didn't know what to do with microprocessors, till 1974, where people thought of myriad applications, now it pays for its research and development cost in just a few months. It's a runaway success. And Gordon Moore, I think, is fully justified in saying, remember, this happened in 1974, which you can think of the end of the 60s, right? The 60s went roughly until about 1974. And it was time of turmoil and revolution. But Gordon Moore says, I'd like to think that we are the real revolutionaries of the world. Things were being revolutionized a lot more by electronics technology than by some political things going on. And here we see a picture of here's a picture of the 8080. You can see it's a little harder to see the transistors. They get denser all the time. But this is still a chip. It's not a computer. Nobody thinks that to build a computer yet. In 1975, suddenly we have an announcement in Popular Electronics of a computer called the Altair 8080. It's a very small computer. It's a kit. It's a mail order kit. You don't get a computer. You get pieces so you can, as a hobbyist, you can put it together yourself. Has very little memory, 256 bytes. No keyboard, no screen, just some electronics. The magazine described it as Project Breakthrough, world first mini computer kit to rival commercial models. Magazine fudged the issue of practicality because it didn't know what to say about it. So it says, it promised manifold uses we cannot even think at this time. So really they couldn't. How did you program it? Well, there was a row of toggles in the front. You had to switch the toggles to program it. I mean, there's no keyboard. All you can do is switch some toggles. There's no screen. all it could do back is flash some lights at you. Not a very useful machine. It was made in Albuquerque, company that I bet you've never heard of, called Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, founded by a person you've never heard of, called Ed Roberts. And this useless piece of electronics sold tens of thousands of mail orders, so of these kits. Made very well. And in fact, did so well, it caught the attention of two guys, Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Remember them from Trafo Data? They have another idea. At this point, Bill Gates, I think, is a student at Harvard. Paul Allen is in some local college, and they decide they are going to Albuquerque. They start a company there called Micro-Soft. Only later they dropped the dash. And the company business is to write BASIC interpreter. So this is to enable to write programs in a programming language called BASIC for this computer, because people don't want just to sit there and toggle switches. They want to be able to write programs. So this is their business. They start in the programming language business. They write an interpreter for BASIC. It's a programming language. So this is the Altair 8080. The name Altair, I'm told, is coming from some Star Trek episode. So indeed, the folks who did this kind of thing were usually hobbyists, and somehow electronics goes together with Star Trek. Something called the Homebrew Computer Club. These are hobbyists. They meet about once every other week in a local, usually in the Stanford Auditorium. And they had two members that became rather well known. One is called Steve Wozniak. The other one is called Steve Jobs. Now, Wozniak is a cute guy. He just basically, what he wants to do there, he likes to impress the other folks. Now, he doesn't have money to buy the Altair 8080 because the Intel chip is rather expensive. Remember, it costs about $360. But at this point, there's competition to Intel. There's a company called MOS Technology, and they make a chip called the Mostek 6502. It only costs $20. Remember, price keeps falling. So he buys the chip, and he built his own computer, which later became known as the Apple I. Okay? And Jobs is the businessman. He said, look, we can sell it. And they start making this. They make them one by one, and they sell them in the famous garage. And they sold them for $666.66, and they sold about 175 of these machines. But they tried to get other companies interested, so they went around. They went to HP, Hewlett-Packard, which is the first electronic companies in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley. No interest. They go to Atari, very successful video game company. In fact, Steve Jobs is working at this point for Atari. They try to interest Atari. Atari says, not interested. Who wants to have a personal computer? They go to Intel. Intel is not interested. Nobody thinks, why do you need a personal computer? Finally, they managed, through some connections, to get funding, and the company was launched in 1977. In April 1977, the Apple II made its debut at the inaugural West Coast Computer Fair. This was more a computer as we think of it today. It was has plastic around it. Now, this seems trivial that a computer should have plastic around it, but the first computer did not have any packaging. It has keyboard, it has screen, it has storage. It's a real computer. And the personal computer business started essentially in 1977. But there's still a real question. What do you do with a computer? You can type on a keyboard, but what do you do? And then something that today we call the killer app. The killer applications came about, VisiCalc. The Apple II found its eventual home in business. That was the key thing, to go from home to business. It was the prayers of all those middle managers who had not been able to gain access to the company mainframe. The compelling application was VisiCalc, published in 1979. A spreadsheet program so important that it alone justified the computer purchase. VisiCalc eliminated the need to wait 6 weeks for the computer department to prepare a report, dragging the answers to simple business questions from corporate data. It allowed the user to do complex financial forecasting. How many people here use spreadsheets? Physical started it. It sold 150,000 copies in 1981, and its practicality helped make the Apple machine a business tool. That was very important, became a business tool. Okay? There is a little anecdote here, which is somebody at Apple said, this is such a wonderful thing, maybe we should buy it. And went to Intel management, went to talk to the physical people. They says, yeah, it would be nice to be bought by Apple. This was before we had all these IPOs and people were getting millionaires. So he went to Apple management and they says, nah. So Apple has a history of making big strategic mistakes. Well, what's happening in Intel in the meantime? Let's go back to Intel. So remember, in 1974, Intel launched the 8080. That was the 8-bit microprocessor. And they now are getting very bold, and they say, instead of getting to the 16 bits, we will go directly to the 32-bit microprocessor. And they embarked on a project it was called the IAPX432, a 32-bit microprocessor. They overstretched. They couldn't do it. By 1979, it was still not done. It finally came out in February 1981, by which time it was completely dead on arrival. It was a disaster. And very quickly, it became clear to them that this is a disaster and it will take a long time. So they say, well, in the meantime, we have to have some interim products. They really believed in that project, but they say it's going slow. We need some interim products. So first, they come up with something called the 8085. In 1976, introduced a 16-bit microprocessor, the 8086. Now, this is a bold decision because they're already investing a lot of money in this IAPX432. But they said, well, we need something just to tie us up until we get the IAPX432 out. Now, it's the late in the 1980s, and Intel has competition. They're not the only one in the microprocessor business. There is Motorola. There is Zilog, a company that was started by Federico Fagin, the guy who designed the 4004, the 8008. The guy knows how to build chips. He goes and starts another company. In fact, Intel had the weakest product on the market. They get very desperate. They sit down and they decide they have to crush the competition. They come up with an operation called Operation Crush. And they think, well, we have lousy products, so we have to make up for it in other ways. And they come up with really very clever marketing ways, and they work very hard. And by the end of 1990, they've become the dominant microprocessor company. And one of the things they decided to do, they said, well, we have to make it easy for people to hook a 16-bit microprocessor into current machines. So they create a device called 8088, which is a 16-bit microprocessor, but the data goes in only 8 bits at a time. That's called 8-bit bus. And again, this is just so you can take such a chip and plug it into an old machine. And they decide they're going to market it very, very aggressively. So one of their salespeople, Earl Whetstone, decides he's going to call IBM. He wasn't very hopeful, but he said, what do I have to lose? I'll call IBM. His timing could not have been better. So remember, the time is now. We're in 1980. VisiCalc is out. Business people are buying computers. In fact, Apple is not the only company. There's other companies. Radio Shack started making computers. Atari started making computers. Commodore was another company. This is now growing business. And they sell to business. And IBM started to pay attention. They want a piece of the pie. But this is not an easy thing for them because they're really into big computers. So really a Maverick Group, a guy called Bill Lowe, comes to IBM management and says, look, this is out of the normal design of products IBM. give me a team. We'll sit in Florida. Most of IBM is on the East Coast, in Westchester County in New York. We'll sit in Florida, Boca Raton, Florida, and we'll design a personal computer. It will be outside of it, won't be compete with the rest of IBM products. Let me try to do it. They said, OK, go ahead. They decided to give him the go-ahead. Now, he cannot build the whole thing all on his own, so he decides to outsource some of the critical components. He has a small team. So he decides that he's going to buy the microprocessor, and Intel come and and presents them this 8088. They say, well, that sounds good. We'll take the 8088. And also, they need an operating system. So they buy the operating system, DOS, from Microsoft. The amazing mistake, they probably will get into the history of business as one of the worst business decisions in history, was that they didn't demand exclusive license. They licensed the products, but they let both Intel and Microsoft keep the rights to the products. And this is what led to the clone industry. The PC was launched on August 12, 1981. Amazing success. They had to quadruple production. It sold beyond anybody's expectation. It sold so well that other people realized that they can also make personal computers, because after all, you can go to Intel and buy the microprocessor, and you can go to Microsoft and buy the operating system. This is the software that runs the machine. So anybody can build a PC. A bunch of people here in Houston decided they can build a PC. In 1982, they launched Compaq. In 1983, January 1983, Time magazine nominated the PC as the man of the year. Historical milestone. Okay. So this is the story of how we start from the transistor, and we went all the way to the personal computer, becoming the man of the year. And this is a good point, I think, to stop that particular line of the story. So let's try to see who invented the microprocessor. Well, as usual, there was a big fight between Intel and TI. For years, they fought about it. Eventually, they had to settle. Cross-licensing, the way companies do it. But the very prestigious, just after the Nobel Prize, $500,000 Kyoto Award for the invention of the microprocessor. The people in TI probably also did very inventive things, but the winners get to write history. But there are some characters that we should not forget. Let's start with this one. Who is this one? Bill Gates in Belgium getting a pie on his face. Okay, everybody knows of Bill Gates. Another important person. Who is this person? It's a bit fuzzy. But I bet no one here knows him. You've never seen his picture before in your life. No, it's not Bill Clinton. His name is Gary Kildall. Have you ever heard of Gary Kildall? No, you didn't hear of Gary Kildall. Who is Gary Kildall? Well, Gary Kildall is a very important person because he wrote the first operating system for a personal computer. The operating system was called CP/M, CP/M. And in fact, he made another important invention. He invented something called BIOS. If you are playing with computers, you may know there is a chip there called BIOS. All you know is that sometimes it causes trouble, right? That's what you know about it. The BIOS is very important. It's called Basic Input-Output System. It enables you to run the same operating systems on different machines by just changing one piece, the BIOS. Okay, one program that's on a chip. So this invention, so he's working throughout the late 70s. By 1981, 500,000 copies of CP/M were sold. Because if you bought a computer, either it was an Apple computer, which had its own operating system, all other computers run CP/M. Just like today, every computer runs Windows, except for Apple. Then every computer was running CP/M. This was a standard operating system for non-Apple machines. So he was a millionaire. The guy did very well. So when IBM decides to build a PC, whom are they going to call? They're going to call Gary Kildall. So they call Gary Kildall. And this story is the stuff of legends. Nobody knows exactly what happened there. So everybody knows that they called Gary Kildall and they went to see him. Well, Bill Gates claims that Gary Kildall went flying. He likes flying, and he just didn't make up the appointment with the IBM folks. That's probably not true. That's probably simply not true. Another version is that IBM came to Kildall and it says, let's negotiate, but first we want to design a non-disclosure agreement. Kildall says, I ain't signing any non-disclosure agreement. End of negotiations. Probably the correct one, they did negotiate, they could not agree on the terms. So they go home, they still need an operating system. Somebody tells them, oh, they're this small company, tiny company in Seattle, but this time Microsoft dropped the dash and moved from Albuquerque to Seattle. So they call Microsoft. They actually call Microsoft because Microsoft does BASIC. They want BASIC to run on the PC. So they go to Seattle to talk to Microsoft about BASIC. And then Gates asks them, well, do you have an operating system? And they says, well, not yet. Well, Gates doesn't have an operating system. But there's another guy in Seattle called Tim Patterson, who started a company called Seattle Computer Products. This guy has written an imitation of CP/M. I mean, today we think that to imitate something is, today we are, we have intellectual property, and how dare you imitate my stuff. This was looser time. So Tim Patterson wrote an imitation of CP/M. Everybody knew about it, but Gary Kildall didn't care. He was making enough money. The fact that somebody in Seattle making a little imitation didn't seem to matter to him very much. So Bill Gates goes to Tim Patterson, says, can I buy your operating system, which is called QDOS, Quick and Dirty Operating System. That's what it was, Quick and Dirty Operating System. And he says, can I buy it from you? And again, the different sources disagree on how much he paid for it. One version says $30,000. Another version says $50,000. That's another version says $75,000. It was under $100,000. It doesn't tell him that he's going to give it to IBM. He just says, I need it for something. So $100,000 sounds like a lot of money at the time. So Tim Patterson sells the operating system to Bill Gates, who then goes on to negotiate with IBM. Not only strikes a deal with IBM to give it to them, but managed to keep the rights for Microsoft. Microsoft retains the right for DOS. Now, it's not surprising that IBM agrees to make business with Intel, because at this point, Intel is a large established company. Not as large as today, but still a fairly established company. It is still somewhat surprising they're willing to put an important piece of their product in the hands of a little company nobody's heard of, Microsoft. This is almost puzzling. And one explanation is that the story is that when the IBM guys went to John Opel, who was then the CEO of IBM, and they told him about it, he says, Bill Gates, is he the son of Mary Gates? Turned out that he knew his mother. And that's probably why the deal went through. So what's happening with Gary Kildall? Remember, Gary Kildall was the guy who really wrote this operating system. When Gary Kildall hears about it, he's really, really angry, and he threatens to sue IBM. It's not clear that he can win, but IBM says, you know what? We will also market CP/M for the PC. Let's call it CP/M 86, and we'll market it for the PC. They sign an agreement. However, the agreement doesn't say what will be the price of CP/M. Turns out that while DOS was priced at $40, CP/M was priced at $240. So nobody's going to buy CP/M. 6 times as expensive. So CP/M was dead on arrival. People still don't understand how this came about. Was this one another one of Gates' machination? But nobody knows for sure. What's clear was that CP/M was dead. DOS, Microsoft made money, incredible amount of money, from selling millions of copies of DOS. Kildall drifted into depression and alcohol. He wrote a tell-all memoir, which was never published, even after his death. His son is afraid to publish it because he thinks he'll probably get sued by Bill Gates if he publishes it. He died just a few years ago, July 1994, age 52, suffered a head injury under very mysterious circumstances, not clear whether it was self-inflicted or a fight or or he just fell. But when he died, this person that made tremendous contribution, his obituary did not even make the San Jose Mercury News, the chief newspaper in Silicon Valley. There's another character we should go back and visit. Shockley. Remember Shockley? We left him at Shockley Semiconductors after the traitorous 8 left. The company did not do well, continued not to do well. Shockley did not change. He was still a terrible manager. They changed the name. They finally sold the company, and he just gradually faded away into oblivion. Shockley himself, about 1960, decided that business is not his forte. He got an endowed chair at Stanford, went to become a professor at Stanford, and became incredibly famous, or infamous, for espousing the idea of racial genetic inferiority. He was universally reviled. This was one of the worst hires made by Stanford University. He died of prostate cancers about 10 years ago. But he played a very important role. Despite all his immense contributions, Shockley never got to become the millionaire he longed to be. He had recruited a critical mass of first-rate scientists and engineers to the Stanford area. They left his struggling band to start a dizzying succession of new semiconductor firms and turned a dry, sleepy valley of lush apricot orchards into the greatest fountain of wealth on the planet. The brash entrepreneurial spirit that began with those 1957 defections from Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory multiplied 100-fold as job hopping and piracy of trade secrets became commonplace. In the process of turning silicon into gold, many others became millionaires, and a few even billionaires. But due to fate and his own obstinacy, Shockley never got a chance to enter this promised land himself. This is why he truly deserved the title, the Moses of Silicon Valley. But his invention will live for a long time. Today, the transistor, smaller than a bacterium, is but a little more than an abstract physical principle imprinted innumerable times on slivers of silicon, millions of microscopic ripples on a shimmering crystal sea. As Moore observed, there are now more transistors made every year than raindrops falling on California. And it costs less to produce one than to print a single character. In fact, somebody made a calculation that if we divide all the transistors in the world among all the ants in the world, every ant will get several transistors. Plenty of transistors for everyone. Remember the 4004? Well, you think it's dead. It's not dead. Even today, the 4004 is still blazing new trails. It is the brain of the Pioneer 10, which was launched on March 2, 1972, to gather the first close-up images of Jupiter, as he now is now exploring space beyond the solar system, where no microprocessor has gone before. So this is the story of the microprocessor. But I want to end without some further reflection, not on what happened so far, but on what is going to happen. The real question that you ought to ponder is what technology is doing to us, what it has done, and what it will continue to do. This was a special issue of New York Times on technology. And they said the following: technology is changing the world. But what is it doing to us? Propelling us into a new age of affluence or dragging us into a robber baron area of widening income disparities, liberating us from stultifying bureaucracies or creating unprecedented opportunities for hidden persuaders, wiring us for success or driving us to destruction. On balance, does technology make us better? Well, here is one answer to that. The language is a bit stultified, but bear with me. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish this epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast-frozen relations and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face, with sober senses, his real conditions of life and his relation with his mankind. Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, 1848. That's a bit pessimistic. So I'd like to think of something on a bit more positive note. Still, the question recurs, can we do better? The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must strive with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. Familiar? Abraham Lincoln, second inaugural address. So as we fast forward into the unpredictable future, let's take a minute to reflect on what we are. We may take some comfort in knowing that however exotic the landscape of tomorrow's world might become, the felt core of human existence, the urge for family, the need for love and belonging, and the desire to live a significant and productive life will remain as familiar as always. Our future will not be decided by the high-tech gizmos of tomorrow, but by the flesh and blood men and women of today, now engaged in an epochal quest whose outcome no one can predict. And the way, in my opinion, to face the future is by being optimistic. Optimism is a strategy for making a better future. Because unless you believe that the future can be better, it is unlikely you will step up and take responsibility for making it so. If you assume that there is no hope, you guarantee that there is no hope. If you assume that there are opportunities to change things, then there is a chance that you may contribute to making a better world. The choice is yours. And in conclusion, remember this. The meek did not inherit the earth, the geeks did. Any questions? What physical size? Yeah. The size hasn't changed over the years. Typically chips are between 200 and 400 square millimeters. The size doesn't change, the density changes. Other questions? Yes?
Can you
expand just very briefly on the history of internet itself, just the actual, the internet, the email, that sort of thing?
Internet started as a project of the Advanced Research Project Agency of the Department of Defense. And the goal was to have a network that will be non-centralized. And that means that if you destroy some parts of the rest of the pieces will continue to function, which was important at the time because people were worried about nuclear attack. So you don't want anything centralized. So the internet was designed as a decentralized network. And it went from 1969, that started by it had about four nodes, and it developed throughout the 70s. I started using the internet in 1981. At the time, it had a few hundred nodes of mostly research universities. But remember the exponential progression, kept doubling and doubling and doubling. And it went from a defense tool to a research tool to finally, in the early 90s, to commercial tool. And then in the 95, suddenly, bang, the internet appeared like Aphrodite, complete. But it was really a project that was going on for many years. Last question.
The Boston Consulting Group did a lot of work. I can't remember the era. But
Which group again?
Boston Consulting Group about
Right.
the experience curve and the effects of compound doubling of production and how it drove down the cost curve. Industry still use a lot of that today. Do you know whether the computer experience is borne out that, or has it radically changed any of that experience curve theory?
No other technology. Every technology starts with a big ramp up. No other technology has sustained an exponential progression so fast and so long as the information technology. So there have been such improvements before, but this is the first time this has happened in our history. That's why we don't really know where it's taking us. We do know that the current technology, current silicon technology, will probably reach a dead end in about a decade. But we don't know what's going to happen afterwards. Really last question.
Any comments on biological computers?
So as I said, we know that the current silicon technology will run its course in about 10 years, and we are not going to be able to get more improvement. And there are many people who are already thinking about what's beyond that. There are people who think of molecular computing, using individual molecules as switches. People talk about DNA computing. People talk about quantum computing. But at this point, all of these are speculations, and it's not clear that by the time silicon slows down, there will be something else to take its place. We might have a plateau before some new technology comes in. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's get